things that we have at stake in Afghanistan that would ordinarily be considered worth the waging of war as a means to pursue are considerably narrower, and I would argue are essentially the two U.S. interests that the administration has already identified for Afghanistan: that it not become a base for attacking us, and that it not become a base for destabilizing its neighbors in the region, and especially Pakistan. Of those two U.S. interests, the first, that the country not become a base for Osama bin Laden to attack us, is the one that's more often talked about. But the second, that Afghanistan not become a source for instability in its region, is, in my view, the more important of the two. Obviously, Afghanistan can become a base for attacking us. It was in 2001. It could again if the Karzai government were to fall and be replaced by some kind of a Taliban version 2.0 restoration. But so could lots of other places. So could Yemen. So could Somalia. So could Djibouti. So could potentially dozens of poorly governed, ill-governed, or ungoverned spaces around the world, any one of which could conceivably become a haven or a base camp from which al-Qaeda could strike the United States or other targets in the developed West. If, as a strategy for denying Osama bin Laden base structure for attacking the United States, we are going to send 6 to 10 brigades of American combat ground forces to prevent this from occurring, we are going to run out of brigades a long time before Osama bin Laden runs out of prospective havens. This is not a viable grand strategy globally for the conduct of a war against al-Qaeda that is potentially much wider than Afghanistan. But whereas there's nothing literally unique about Afghanistan as a base for attacking us, Afghanistan is unique geographically as a base for destabilizing Pakistan. It is immediately across the Durand Line. Its largest single ethnic subgroup, the Pashtun ethnicity, has more members on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line than it does on the Afghan side of the Durand Line. Pakistan is a country in which clear vital national security interests of the United States are at stake. It is a deeply divided, unstable state facing an ongoing insurgency that crossed the border into the definition of war by most academic definitions of war a long time ago, and a country in which by many indicators that war is not going particularly well. It is the current global base of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and it has a real, live, honest-to-goodness, intact, extant, and usable nuclear arsenal. Should Pakistan fail in the conduct of its ongoing insurgency, should the secular government collapse and be replaced by chaos, we could easily imagine that that Pakistani nuclear arsenal could breach containment. Should its control collapse, that constitutes, in my view, one of the very few ways in which al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden could plausibly get their hands on a real usable nuclear weapon. Pakistan is terribly important to the United States. Afghanistan is right across the Durand Line. One might reasonably suppose that chaos in Afghanistan could be a contributor to instability in a country that matters centrally to us. This, it seems to me, is a rather consequential U.S. interest. Now, given this, however, why should we not argue, as does, for example, the Vice President of the United States, that if our real, unique national security interests in South Asia are in Pakistan, why then are we spending all of our money, all of our military effort, and sacrificing the amount of blood that we are now sacrificing on the other side of the Durand Line? Why don't we deal with the real problem, which is al-Qaeda and Pakistan and its nuclear arsenal, directly via U.S. policy towards Pakistan. Plausible, sensible line of argument. The central problem with it is I can't think of any U.S. policy towards Pakistan that can solve the problem. We are politically radioactive in Pakistan today. We are not going to deploy 68,000 American ground forces to assist the Pakistani government in the conduct of counterinsurgency within its borders. That's not going to happen. We could provide aid. We have been providing billions of dollars in aid since 2001 to 2. It is routinely diverted to purposes other than those we intend. And I submit that that's likely to continue and that no feasible program of conditionality that the U.S. Congress could impose on this aid can in practical terms prevent the Pakistanis from diverting it to purposes other than those we intend. I could go through a longer list of potential U.S. policy initiatives vis-a-vis Pakistan, but if you will indulge me, my conclusion when I do that is I can't think of any that are very likely to have very much traction in reducing the scale of a truly extraordinary threat to U.S. national security interests in the course of the Pakistani insurgency. If we have a situation in which we have very important national interests at stake, not very much we can do to make the situation very much better, it seems to me that an appropriate U.S. approach to policy vis-a-vis this threat is invoke the Hippocratic Oath. At least do no harm. And it seems to me that one of the more impressive ways that we can make things a lot worse in Pakistan if we try is should the counterinsurgency project in Afghanistan fail. And if the current Karzai government in Afghanistan is replaced either with chaos and a return to the civil warfare of the 1990s or by some sort of neo-Taliban restoration in Kabul, either one of those conditions, it seems to me, creates a potentially state-scale haven for insurgent and terrorist organizations bent on the collapse of the current government in Islamabad and the control of its nuclear arsenal. We have traditionally and historically worried about the spillover effects of chaos and internal warfare. That was one of the central rationales, for example, for our involvement in the Balkans in the 1990s. If we allow in Afghanistan a condition of collapse, chaos, and instability right across the border from a country that matters as much to us as Pakistan, we are, as we would have in the Balkans, substantially increasing the risk of spillover effects. There's a lot of talk about the spillover of insurgents from bases in Pakistan into Afghanistan. I would argue that in many ways in the medium to long term, the other way is a bigger threat. So we have some important interests at stake, but they're indirect. The more compelling of the U.S. national interest in Afghanistan isn't in Afghanistan at all, its effect on its neighbors. They're also not unlimited in scale and scope. You could easily imagine that we could invest tremendous resources in Afghanistan, buck up the Karzai government, defeat the Taliban on Afghanistan's side of the Durand line, and if the Pakistani government doesn't get its act in gear and improve the conduct of its own counterinsurgency on its side of the Durand line, it could collapse anyway. Its nuclear arsenal could breach control, Osama bin Laden could get a weapon, in spite of our best efforts in Afghanistan. Conversely, you could imagine that if we fail in Afghanistan and Karzai and his government collapse, if the Pakistanis do put their house in order, and if they do focus the resources at their disposal on the conduct of their own counterinsurgency, they might succeed in that undertaking. The Pakistani nuclear arsenal could remain under control, Al-Qaeda could remain suppressed, and U.S. interests would not be gravely threatened anyway. Success in Afghanistan does not predetermine